Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 12th seminar or webinar of the KIX EAP Hub. KIX stands for Knowledge and Innovation Exchange, and EAP stands for Europe, Asia, Pacific. We are a hub serving 21 countries that are part of the GPE network. GPE is Global Partnership for Education, and we are extremely pleased that we are able to coordinate these efforts. In total, there are 4 hubs, and all of them are at the global level administered by IDRC, which stands for International Development Research Center in Ottawa. It is with funding from GPE, and the spirit of GPE and the KIX initiative is all about giving voice to local expertise, use research for policy and planning, and learn from peer exchange. So we are the one for this region coordinating these efforts, and we think that Paulo Freire's work speaks directly to the idea of empowerment, giving expertise to local experts, amplifying their voice, and all of this. Today is a special day because 2 of our countries in the region are at war with each other. It would be strange not to address this issue. And together with CIS, together with the Graduate Institute, together with many, many universities and teacher education institutions, we express our compassion with the Ukrainian people that suffer from the war, but also we stand in solidarity with those in Russia, in Ukraine, all over the world that protest war and violence. So please bear with us, and we hope that the next time we meet with each other in the webinar, the situation will be better for all involved. Many schools, many education institutions, many teachers, students, parents have been displaced as a result of the war. And we can only hope that the situation gets better. Thanks again for joining. And I'm very pleased to pass the floor to José Luis, who will introduce KIX, but also this great caliber of panelists for this event. José Luis is the hub manager. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Ramsey. So today webinar is our 12th and the last in our first 2 years of work. So I think this is a good time also that we remember what the KIX EAP Hub is all about. And I ask Anna Karish to share the screen and show us a short clip about our hub.
In GPE partner countries of the Europe, Asia, Pacific region, limited resources have been invested so far on mobilizing and using knowledge, data, and studies produced at the national and global level, identifying and learning from promising innovations, and sharing experiences on similar reforms in other countries. To respond to these challenges, the Knowledge and Innovation Exchange, KIX, Europe, Asia, and Pacific Hub connects knowledge by mobilizing global and national expertise for policy research and practice, innovation by identifying and learning from scalable innovations for policy and project design, and exchange by promoting a regional network for peer exchange and learning amongst national experts. The KIX EAP Hub creates opportunities for knowledge producers and users to meet, learn, and exchange experiences on what works and what doesn't work in improving their national education systems. The Hub is led by NORAG, with the support of the Global Partnership for Education and the International Development Research Center. It covers 21 countries located in Europe, Asia, the Pacific, Middle East, and North Africa. The Hub's activities are demand-driven and designed to give voice and visibility to key country actors and institutions while supporting them to improve the inclusion, equity, and quality of education systems and accelerate progress towards SDG 4. Which activities is the Hub offering to country participants? Webinars, learning cycles and workshops, regional conferences, podcasts, blog posts and video interviews, digital learning platform, and inter-country visits. Activities are conducted in English, Russian, and Arabic. Interested in engaging in the KIX EAP Hub? Visit us online.
So this is a short clip outlining what we are doing and why we are having the KIX EAP Hub and connecting people from the national education systems from our Europe Asia Pacific region. So I'll now briefly introduce today's webinar that focuses on education as development in the centenary of Paulo Freire. Annika, if you can screen share the agenda, otherwise I will continue. Exactly. Oh, Veronica is here, exactly. So we'll have Tristan McCowan, Professor of International Education at University College London Institute of Education. We'll open the webinar with Education and Sustainable Development, Perspectives from Paulo Freire. We'll then have a first time for Q&A session. Please include your questions and comments in the chat at any moment during the session, and we will read them at the given Q&A sessions. Rasha Sharaf, Professor of International Comparative Education at Helwan University in Egypt, and also my colleague as KIX EAP Knowledge Leads, will address teachers as development agents in the Arab region, a reflection on Freire's teachers as cultural workers. A second moment of Q&A will precede the contribution from Sajid Ali, Chinoy Associate Professor, Aga Khan University, Institute for Education Development in Pakistan, who will bring education development in Pakistan, some critical reflections. Following again a short Q&A, Alexandre Durmier Freire, Senior Lecturer in the Interdisciplinary Programs at the Graduate Institute of International Development Studies in Geneva, will lead us into a reflexive journey with Paulo Freire in Palestine and Vietnam. We'll then have a longer space for questions and discussion before closing the webinar. With no further delay, it is a pleasure to give the floor to Professor Tristan McCowan, who will be the first to guide us into this knowledge and learning experience. Professor Tristan McCowan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jose, and it's a huge pleasure to be with you here today. Partly to learn more about KIX, which looks like a fascinating project, and really looking forward to hearing the other participants and speakers. But also, of course, because we're here to discuss Paulo Freire, this is a crucial topic for any time, but particularly at the moment. Now, I'm not a Freire scholar in terms of pouring in a detailed way through all of his texts. My experience of Freire comes through many years of working in Brazil and having the huge privilege of experiencing many initiatives in what in Latin America is called popular education, and in adult education, but also formal education as well in schools and universities of use of his ideas. And some crucial insights that he had that have fundamentally changed the way that I view both education and development. So I'm going to share a few of those with you today. And particularly in relation to an area that I'm focusing on at the moment, which is around the idea of sustainability, sustainable development. My current work is on higher education and climate change, climate action, climate justice. I've also done some work around the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. So I've been thinking about this particularly. And Freire has a huge amount to offer in this regard. Sustainable development is quite a shell concept. There's not much that ties it down. I think what we can say about sustainable development is that firstly, it has to be something that continues through time. It can't extinguish itself or destroy itself. So I think that's the idea of the term sustainable that's tagged on to development. And I think every conception of sustainable development also includes attention to both human communities and to the natural environment. So it's something to do with reconciling the interests of both of these and the interactions between them. But that leaves a huge area of contestation. I mean, even if you make sure that both of these criteria are in place. There's a vast range of positions of how you might interpret what sustainable development is, partly because we're not in agreement over what is it about our world, our societies, that is actually causing them not to be sustainable, and how we might go about addressing it. So there's a range of positions on sustainable development that go from ones which say basically our current system is good, but we need to tinker around the edges to adjust a few small things, and then we can make sure that things are all the way to the other end that says that we have a fundamentally corrupt and flawed and dysfunctional system of organizing our societies, collecting knowledge, distributing knowledge, and even our whole conception of what we are as beings is fundamentally flawed, anthropocentric, and destined to destruction. So within that spectrum, all of this people can call sustainable development. So it's really important that we reflect critically on it, and I think Freire can help us to do this. So in the short time that we have, I'll just throw in 3 ideas from Freire that for me are fundamental, and then talk about how they can open up our thinking around sustainable development and climate change and the environment, but not in ways that are separated from our concerns around global social justice, which are intimately linked at the moment. These are all one of them. So for me, the first key aspect of Freire's thought is that development is intrinsically human. Now, this may seem like something of an unnecessary thing to say, a tautology, but it's amazing how many conceptions of development place human beings rather at the periphery of what's happening. If we take indicators of development based purely on GDP level or growth, or observations about the level of infrastructure in a country, or even institutions sometimes, human beings are placed in a rather secondary level. And Freire was distinct both in relation to the political left, many aspects of it at the time, but also many of the more capitalist conceptions of development, of saying, no, the human being is, when we're talking about development of a society, it's about the development of human beings. And the material aspects of society and the external trappings adjust themselves in accordance with our development as people, and not individually, but collectively. So that's the first key aspect, and sometimes his ideas around with some other similar thinkers are actually referred to as radical humanism, which emphasizes this point. Second key aspect, and I think this is probably what Freire is best known for, is his insight into the connections between the educational and the political. And that the severe disempowerment of citizens in Northeast Brazil, where he was originally working, peasant communities, landless sugarcane cutters and so forth. This absolutely extreme exclusion and marginalization from power over their own lives and over involvement in decision-making about society. That this was reflected in their disempowerment within the learning spaces. And so either complete exclusion from any formal education or other opportunities for learning, or even when they were allowed into school, a level of exclusion and marginalization from horizontal participation in the learning process. And that reverting that situation, the empowerment of the learner would then lead to empowerment within the political sphere. So that the formation of subjects, and the word subject in English is a very ambiguous one, because it can mean in a very contradictory way both being an agent but also being an object of somebody else's power. So in English it's a very problematic term, slightly less so in Portuguese and Freire was using. But the formation of subjects, agents, I think is a less ambiguous term in English. in the learning space then translates into the transformation of society through the expression of their political agency. But in a collective way, and this is where Freire differs from many of the other thinkers in the European tradition and in other parts of the world that are associated with progressive education, is that this is not what some people have called a therapeutic form of learner-centeredness. It's intrinsically political because it's about collective organization and change. So learners are changing individually, but they're also creating a project collectively for the benefit of all in accordance with justice. So that's the second key point. And the third one, which is very closely linked to the second, is that there's no such thing as neutrality. There's no neutral education. And this was a point that I was interested in back in the days when I was doing my own master's and PhD research, which was focused on citizenship education. And there was a lot of discussion in the UK where I'm based, but also other countries where I've been working about, the extent to which schools should be places for talking about controversial issues and political issues and so forth. What Freire says is that, look, we cannot avoid this. And it's not just because political issues crop up in the classroom. They do, but even if you could have, I don't know, a biology class or a maths class where you could avoid any discussion of society at all, even completely on an abstract numerical plane, even then it's political. Because any pedagogical interaction involves the meeting of people that can lead either to a reinforcement of lack of agency and disempowerment, or the encouragement of agency and empowerment just through the pedagogical interaction. And this is the crucial insight of Freire and how, and then, educators can't sit on the fence. Educators for Freire they're either liberating or they're domesticating, to use his terms. Creates a very stark decision and responsibility for educators about their role. And I think it's a very affirming one. Some people have seen Freire as perhaps being a bit undermining of teachers. I think this is a complete misunderstanding of his position. There are other radical thinkers like Ivan Illich who did want to replace the teacher or profoundly alter that. Freire was very supportive of teachers, but saw that the teachers needed to change their posture. They needed to respect the learners in their classrooms and to understand with humility that they could learn from the people who they were teaching. But it doesn't mean that the teacher is taken out of the picture or loses their position, their central position in education. So no neutrality. Okay, and I'll now, in the final part of this brief bimper, I'll say how all of this relates specifically to sustainable development. I think it's important to emphasize that there is some debate in the field, in the literature, about sustainability, ecology, and Freire's ideas. And there are some criticisms of Freire in his the idea that he's tightly bound up with the Western Enlightenment, anthropocentrism, has a very strong humanist drive, which some radical ecologists are very critical of because it emphasizes the human being to the detriment of the non-human world. So there are some criticisms. I think it's important to locate his thought historically in quite a different time. Most of his ideas have been created, and I think his ideas would have shaped themselves in different ways at a different point in time. Moacir Gadotti, who is some of you may know as a Brazilian commentator on these issues, and part of an eco-pedagogy movement that directly uses Freire's ideas, challenges this idea and states that he was writing a book about the environment in the latter parts of his life and so forth. And Freire, of course, invites us to take his ideas and to reframe them for different times and different issues. And there's no doubt that these tools, these inspirations that he gave are vital for us in addressing the challenges of sustainability and climate action. And I'll briefly highlight three to finish up. The first is around environmental justice. So we can no longer separate out the questions of protection of the natural environment from the question of the extreme injustice and oppression of human communities. I think there was a time in the past when environmental concern maybe seemed like a bit of a middle class, a bit of a privilege to be worried about the environment, but those days are long gone now. So the extreme injustice that communities face is intimately linked with the environmental destruction. And that means that the conscientization of what Freire describes as the oppressed, the empowerment of these groups and the transformation of societies is part of the process of protecting the natural environment. So these things are now go hand in hand because of the disproportionate impacts of climate and other environmental issues on the poorest communities in the world, and the resource inequalities that have also led to that environmental destruction. So all these questions about creating a more just world is also about creating a sustainable world in terms of the natural environment. Secondly, his neutrality point. So Freire's argument that there's no such thing as neutral education. Well, you can apply that to sustainability and climate change. You know, there's no such thing now as education that doesn't deal with environment and climate change. Because if you don't mention it, then you are supporting the status quo, which is leading to the destruction of everything. So there's no more sitting on the fence for education systems for educators. If you don't deal directly with the environmental crisis that's facing us, then you are supporting that crisis. You're allowing it to happen. So educators can no longer sit on the fence. They have to position themselves. And I'm not for a moment saying that means that we need to talk about climate change the whole time. It's back to Freire's original point. It's about using education as a way of developing critical awareness and an understanding of these issues, so to collectively transform people to address them. And the final point I want to mention is about research. So we think of Freire normally in relation to teaching and learning, and rightly so, but we can also think about his ideas as orienting the research process. And I see from the KIX project that this is, I think this is probably a good example of it. Thinking at the way that you're trying to reframe the movement of knowledge and interactions with people. The way that I've been involved in this is through participatory action research. So for those people who haven't used the method, quite strong roots in different parts of Latin America, also through the Orlando Fals border in Colombia. But Freire's ideas are powerfully underpin this idea that research with communities doesn't need to be extractive. It doesn't need to be separate from the communities that are being researched. So it places those communities at the center of the research processes as agents of research, and not just as either beneficiaries or as objects. And I'm involved in a project called Transforming Universities for a Changing Climate, or Climate U, which is working with universities in Brazil, in fact, but also in Fiji, Kenya, and Mozambique, that places participatory action research at the center of its strategy to work with communities, both to mitigate and also to adapt to the changes in the climate. And that's another important contribution that Freire gives us. So to finish off then, Freire opens up our imaginations about what education can be, and of course what sustainable development can be. We have the framework of the SDGs, and I think the SDGs are a big improvement on what we have at the moment. They provide a useful framework, but they're not the end of the story. They are not enough. We need to go beyond the SDGs. We need to think, we need to use them, but we need to critique them, and we need to go beyond them. And I think Freire provides us with the tools to do that. And he also provides us with an educational model that will allow us to transform ourselves and learners to bring about that. Thanks for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the other talks on different contexts and different ideas, and to hear your comments on this. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Tristan, for this really thoughtful presentation to kick off our webinar. We received in the meantime a comment and a question. I'll read both of you to you so that you can react to them. So first of all, Johnny Birds from Spain has included a comment, a reaction to your presentation, saying, indeed, Paulo Freire wanted teachers to stop teaching and start being companions, which is still a controversy for teachers until the moment. So that's his comments. And then we had a question from Riaz Hussain from Pakistan, who says media plays an important role in construction of identities, narratives, and false consciousness among young learners. What are some of the pedagogies to deal with this situation? If you can address those two, the comments and the question, that would be great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think well, there's a lot of debate about the framing of the teaching in Freire. So, and I think he, in some of his later work, which has quite a different tenor to Pedagogy of the Oppressed, his earlier, best known and most seminal work, I think in his later work, he tries to explain and address some of sometimes misunderstandings or ways people have interpreted and used his work. So his position does change quite a lot through his life, and some of the other speakers might like to comment on this as well. But I think unlike deschooling advocates like Illich, who see that we should end all formal education, there should no longer be professional teachers at all, we should only think about peer learning and self-learning and so forth. Freire didn't want to remove the position of teaching, but did want to change the nature of teaching and the way the teachers saw themselves. So he used this expression, you can be an authority without being authoritative. You don't need to oppress your learners, but you can still be different. You can still have an important role. So I think, yes, maybe stop teaching in a very kind of directive and didactic way, but not to get rid of the teacher altogether. And yes, be a companion, but not necessarily to be exactly the same as the learner. So I think it's a transformation in line with Freire's idea of dialogue, which is not just about conversation, but it's about a respectful sharing of knowledge between people who respect each other's humanities and contribution. And on the media, yeah, I think it's a fantastic point. It's particularly crucial in our current times. Fake news and social media. It's a very complex thing. I think, probably all educational circles are talking about the importance of education in navigating these things. The rise of magical thinking and post-truth, all of these are great challenges. And pretty much everyone supports critical thinking. It's quite rare you ever meet someone who says, well, I'm not in favor of critical thinking. But there's a huge spectrum of ideas of what might be meant by criticality. Sometimes it might be a very small space for interpreting text, something very technical, over to a much fuller and a Freirean conception of critical thinking is really taking a step out of one's reality to develop an understanding of the way society is organized, the interests of different groups, that political consciousness, and also linked to action. So it's not just, it's the connection between reflection and action, the transforming action, that dialectic that's also crucial for Freire. So I'd say he'd have a particular take on the need for developing awareness of media. Thanks for your great questions.
Thank you, Professor. I suggest that we continue this great discussion at the other question and answer breaks that we'll have, and a longer one at the end as well. I think it's a good time for us to move to Professor Rasha Sharaf's presentation, which will focus on teachers as development agents in the Arab region, a reflection on Freire's teachers as cultural workers. Rasha.
Thank you, Marina. Thank you very much. And thank you, Makan, for your interesting, presentation, and it sets the bigger picture, Allow me to share I developed like a PowerPoint presentation with you, and I'm going to discuss today the book of Paulo Freire. But before I start in English, I would try to greet my colleagues in Arabic. أهلا وسهلا بكم جميعا، وأرحب بالزملاء من المنطقة العربية ومنطقة الشرق الأوسط. والحقيقة الموضوع اليوم مهم جدا للمنطقة وللوطن العربي، وأتمنى يكون بالنسبة لكم. دلوقتي أنا هتحول إلى اللغة الإنجليزية ويمكنكم المتابعة بالترجمة إلى اللغة. شكرا جزيلا. Reflection on Freire's teachers as cultural workers, right? Implications for teacher education in the Arab region. I have included here, the pictures and photos of the translated books of Paulo Freire into Arabic. تربية الحرية, which is the pedagogy of freedom and pedagogy of the heart, and and other books that has been written on Paulo Freire in Arabic about his theories and contributions to the education sector. And we can tell that he is one of the most influential educators and thinkers in the field of education and sociology in the region. People really trust the words of Paulo Freire. He's coming from a third world, and he knows our worries, he knows our passion, he knows our challenges, and and we can really trust the way he sees different education issues and challenges into third world countries. He is very popular as well. He's known as the romantic, thinker, because he's talking about the passion and the heart and and freedom and so on. And today I have picked the book Teachers as Cultural Workers because it's very relevant to whatever we do at the faculties of education and at the teacher education programs. And it also relates to the topic of the webinar, which is education as development. Now, if we move on to, teachers as cultural workers, letters to those who dare to teach, who dare to take the decision to be responsible on the future generations and to teach young kids and to influence minds, and it is really a model for education as development. So what type of human beings are we seeking to offer to the future? I mean, what type of thinkers, what type of consumers, what type of contributors to our future? So as Makan has spoken about the sustainable development, so how would people react in the future? What would be their behavior? What would be their attitudes towards environment and towards future challenges facing Earth? So of course, I've picked some of the flashing core messages into the book of Teachers as Social Workers. And then we would start to think, how would this apply to education and teacher education in the Arab world? So the meaning of the act of teaching, as well as the meaning of learning. And here I ask a question: does teaching lead to learning? Does any teaching practices necessarily leads to learning? Well, actually no. Because teacher-centered approaches would really transfer what we think is right for the children and for the learners and for the students. versus, believing that students and learners are human beings who can think, who have minds, who have aspirations, and they can contribute to their own learning. So this is one of the most powerful, messages in the book that would really identify a policy of learning, what type of learning that we are seeking. And here we refer to the intended learning outcomes. And then if you go flashback, what would be the learning experiences that students should go through so as to learn? So teaching as well as the meaning of learning, they meet where the outcomes of learning could be achieved. The second message is the permanent commitment to learning and training, right? And that's a very powerful message to teachers. The role of in-service teacher training, as well as the pre-service, of course, teacher training and teacher education programs, professional development, what type of professional development and knowledge and exchange and innovation like KIX, offering, and the role of in-service and the PLCs, the professional learning communities, how we do learn from each other and how we share experiences. How do we listen about contributions given from other places in the world and other schools and other institutions and so on. The third message is ongoing appraisal of classroom practice. And here I would strongly recommend action research, where teachers are researchers, they reconsider the practices of their own classrooms, how to improve learning outcomes, how to improve students' achievement, how to get rid of the problems that would face the classroom and the school and the whole community and so on. So the ongoing appraisal of classroom practice is really another strong message sent by Paulo Freire to the teachers as well. The different roads students take in order to learn. Different, it means that it's not the unified, fixed road. There's no this one straitjacket way of learning. There are like multiple paths and different roads that we can take in order to learn. So here we believe in differences and individual differences and social inclusion and equity and diversity and many other terms that would really help teachers as well as learners learn in a better way. The final message is that a continual reconstruction of their own paths of curiosity, opening the doors to habits of learning. So, we should be always reflecting on our own practices, rethinking the way we learn. How do we learn better? What are we, comfortable? And that does not mean that we stay in our comfort zone. Is that like we can explore new paths and have a curiosity into the learning process and into the development process as teachers. Thank you, Paulo Freire, for the messages. So how would this relate to the teacher education programs in the Middle East? So I would ask you now to fasten your seatbelts. We're going to go on a ride into the Middle East in some stops across the map. And it might be a bit bumpy, right? So fasten your seatbelts. So teacher education in the Arab region. First of all, I would just sum up my own observations on the pre-service teacher education programs in the Middle East and the Arab region. All right, it's mostly, subject-specific preparation programs. So this is the program of English teachers, of mathematics teachers, of physics teachers, of Arabic language teachers, of social science teachers. So it's kind of a subject-specific preparation programs, and it's very common across the board in all of the Arab countries. It's intensely knowledge-based kind of programs, all right, focusing on the knowledge and subject areas. They are also, the weight of theory is around 70% versus 30% practice, which is not really helpful for the development of teacher competencies and teacher capacities and the way they learn and the way they form their own, habits of learning and teaching practices and so on. So the theory part is really dominating the preparation and the education process for teachers. This very common is that people are talking about templates and formats. all right, molding teaching practices. So it's the role, the best way of doing it. So it's the template for the lesson plan. It's the checklist for the whatever. So it's one way of doing things all the way, which is not, the message that was sent by Paulo Freire about the diverse and different ways of learning and different ways of approaching things and exploring things. The narrow scope of teaching practicum. Now, teaching practicum is, of course, very influential and very important in the development of the teacher personality and teacher competencies. So, and I have other, reservations on the methodology of the teaching practicum, but we need to expand more on teaching practicum. In some countries like Egypt, where I belong, teaching practicum happens only in the 3rd and 4th year and in a very narrow scope of time, a limited time, which would not give the teachers the enough duration and enough experience to develop their own sense of teaching profession and practice their own competencies and skills required into the teaching process. Attitudes. Professional attitudes related to the teaching profession, I call it the lost land. I mean, people very rarely tackle attitudes, and that is exporting a lot of problems to schools. Empathy, integrity, accuracy, and other types of attitudes that a teacher would require really needs to be well instilled into the teacher education programs, and that would really reflect on teaching practices. Research is only restricted to graduate studies. As Paulo Freire has advised almost 30 years ago, that research is one of the powerful tools where teachers can explore their own learning, they can find out different solutions, can experiment things and so on, and see how things are progressing, how things are improving. So research is only restricted to graduate studies in the Arab region, and we need to really rethink the way programs of teacher education into the undergraduate and bachelor degree would look like to integrate research within the preparation process. Students are taught about student-centered strategies, but through a teacher-centered approach. So, they are lectured about student-centered strategies, but they're not experiencing student-centered practices. They get lectures, they get notes, they get memos and things like that. They have it into the written exams. So they hear about student-centered strategies. They know what it should be looking like, but they don't really practice it. And the lack of career guidance and counseling support. There is academic advising and there are office hours, but they are not the career guidance service that student teachers should be receiving, or teachers of the future should be receiving at the Faculty of Education and the teacher education programs. These are like, I don't want to tend to overgeneralize. I mean, it does not apply to all of the faculties of education or the teacher preparation programs in the Arab region, but to the majority, I can say. But what if we move on to the pre-service, the in-service teacher training? I have seen the model of Queen Rania Teacher Academy in Jordan, and it's one of the really very well developed and mature kind of teacher education support programs. They have modules about how to teach like a champion. The heroic role of a teacher is really inspired into the lives of teachers. So you are a champion, you can do a lot, you can make a big difference. Education for environment sustainability, and as McCowan has referred to, is that now it's a crucial component into the education process. And of course, we keep saying you cannot give what you cannot, what you don't have. So there is a training modules about education for environmental sustainability. Another module about professional learning communities, and this is how teachers would grow. Innovation in education is also another cross-cutting theme across the board, which is something that is really fostering differences and different paths of learning, and so on. Schools networks is another, scope of work that Teacher Academy is working on. And they're having this community parent school, the CPS coalition, cultivating inclusive and supportive learning environments, which is very similar to the JZ, the thematic area of KIX EAP on gender equity and social inclusion. Then the Academy is working very intensely on the research and publication. So they do research into the classroom and into the school, and they disseminate knowledge among teachers for a bigger, professional learning community among teachers. So I thought that I would look at the QRTA, which is the Korean Iranian Teacher Academy, as one of the promising models into the Middle East and into the Arab countries that support in-service teacher education programs with the concept of education as development. Another model from Egypt, which is the Professional Academy for Teachers. They have a wide range of elective modules for professional development. So teachers can choose whatever they feel they need to develop. They have continuous assessments for teachers and cadres. It's semi-flexible, so they are like rigid requirements that all teachers should do, so and so and so. But there's room for differences and catering for differences. They have what I call a trendy program. So now the International Baccalaureate is trendy in Egypt, so they have the trendy programs for International Baccalaureate. The EJS is the Egypt-Japan schools, so the EJS training programs, the STEM schools, so we have the STEM training programs, and so on. So it's this category of what I call a trendy programs. They have the mechanism of delegating professional development bodies like universities and training centers to take the role of teacher development, and they certify training centers outside the PAT, which is Professional Academy of Teachers, to carry out the training programs for teachers. All right. In Morocco, the training for teachers, the in-service training of teachers, is carried out by the ministry, and it's centralized, and it's carried out by the training and formation department within the ministry. They are devising teacher competences framework. So there is a teacher framework that guides professional development, and the provision of capacity development is provided locally. They have a centralized training plan, and that is directly geared to the primary education plan. So it's training for, a direct relation to whatever is going on within the primary education sector. Well, so the future, I was confused. I mean, talking about Paulo Freire, who has given the messages in the past 30 years ago, or the future perspective. So I name it future past perspective, inspired by Freire. Faculty members at the Faculty of Education is the starting point, I think. You cannot give what you don't have. So faculty members should really possess the qualities and the competencies that they want to instill into the student teachers. So we should start by the universities and Faculty of Education staff. We need to liberate teachers from the rigid PD and certification requirements. So if we really believe in the diverse and varied paths and different ways of learning, we really need to liberate teachers as far as, of course, I'm not jeopardizing quality, but as far as the quality parameters are met, the required intended learning are happening. We need to recognize, of course, individual differences and that people are different, and curricula at the Faculty of Education needs revision with the focus on intended learning outcomes. So what are the competencies? What are the qualities that teachers should possess for teaching future generations? Attitudes, of course, there would be a focus on attitudes. The road needs to be traveled, as I say, and research competencies need to be integrated in all levels of teacher education programs. Here, students are taught about student-centered strategies through, of course, student-centered strategy approach. So if I want them to really believe in student-centered strategies, they should try it. They should feel that this is the best way students really can learn. And last but not least, like lack of career guidance and counsel support is very important, is that we provide career guidance and counseling support for student teachers at the faculties of education. So teachers as cultural workers would really prove that education has development. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rasha. Thank you for this great presentation. We have received in the meantime some great questions in the chat. I suggest that we address those at the end in the interest of time, but I'm saving them for our discussion at the end. Thank you. And I now give the floor to our next presenter, Professor Sajid Ali, who will talk to us about education developments in Pakistan, some critical reflections. Professor Sajid.
Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can see it.
Well, thank you very much for giving me the floor and for inviting me to this discussion, not least because it made me read Pedagogy of Oppressed. And just as Dr. Rasha and for him, they were trying to think through the lens of Paulo Freire, I thought to do the same. And in doing so, I tried to look at the basic philosophy that Paulo Freire introduced. So I went to the text of the Pedagogy of Oppressed. And so what I'm going to do in my presentation is share some of the excerpts from the Pedagogy of Oppressed. And that triggered various thoughts. And then I will look at the developments of various kinds of developments that are taking place in Pakistani education system, and then some critical reflections on that. On that note, here are some of the key thoughts that I picked from Freire. So the core idea of Pedagogy of Oppressed, and I've highlighted the quote from him, and this is very interesting that Paulo Freire says that the great humanistic and historical task of the oppressed is to liberate themselves and their oppressor as well. And what he means to say by that is it is the only oppressed who can liberate both themselves as well as oppressor. And I think it was very liberating for me, because in our discussion about agent versus so agency versus a structure, we often feel very depressed. So I think there's a message of hope and with a lot of struggle. So that's a core idea that I picked from Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of Oppressed. The second thought that I picked from Paulo Freire is Pedagogy of Oppressed is a pedagogy which must be forged with, not for the oppressed. And I think I was in preparation for this talk today, I looked at various other sources, and I found a very interesting discussion between Bruno, Noam Chomsky, and another gentleman. And they were talking about various things, but one thing that struck me from Noam Chomsky was that a major thinking of Paulo Freire was consciousness raising. And this Pedagogy of Oppressed is an attempt towards that. The other thing that they highlight was that we have to understand the background of Paulo Freire, the background of the 1968, when the first time this Pedagogy of Oppressed was written in Portuguese and later translated in the English version in 1972. And that was, for example, we had Vietnam War, we had the Cold War going on, We also had various movements in the Latin America, some of the religious cultural movements going on. So that provides the backdrop of the pedagogy of oppress. So in order to think of the messages of Paulo Freire, and in order to uplift the teacher education sustainability, teachers, we have to work with and not for the oppressed. And then the famous idea of Paulo Freire, which is the banking concept of education, the knowledge in which he questions the way we have structured our education system, which is kind of a bank in which there are certain depositors, which are like teachers, and students are treated as empty vessels, as depositories where teachers make the deposit. So it's kind of an empty vessel thinking. And what Rasha was, Dr. Rasha was saying before me was again challenging this idea of teaching students through student-centered pedagogies, through making them partners in education rather than doing things for them or to them. I would rather skip this slide, but this is also very interesting of some of the lists of the consequences of what banking education promotes. And essentially it talks about the subject and object. The teacher becomes the center. And I think what Paulo Freire also suggests is that we have to think of the teacher in a larger context, not only the formal teacher, but the teacher in various contexts. So sometimes, and so I'll not spend too much time here, but I think I invite the readers to go and see the pedagogy of oppress themselves. But where I would like to focus more on is this idea that are juxtaposed. So the empty vessel concept of the banking education system is posed against a problem posing education. And what Dr. Trent was also talking about was the education and action research, and the call for action oriented research is to invite us on a dialogue between teachers and students, on an education that is a practice of freedom, not a practice of domination, where teacher and students work together, and teachers is not simply teacher but also student at one time, and a student is not simply student but teacher at other time. So this is a proper problem posing education. Both teachers and students go and to the conquest for exploratory mode, and hence the idea of praxis, which is an invitation to action and reflection, a call for activism. And I think what Dr. Trent talked about being not neutral is relevant here, that we have to take positions. But what I would also like to highlight is that in this world that we live in today, there's a lot of gray that we also have to live with and adjust to, than taking very black and white positions. So with those thoughts of the Paulo Freire at the back, the banking concept, the call for oppressed to liberate both the oppressed and the oppressor, and it is only them who can do certain things. I wanted to share with the audience about several developments that we are seeing in education in Pakistan, and by implications you can, and some may relate to the other developing countries' context as well. And then we'll try and reflect about posing some critical thoughts and questions around those ideas. So here are some of the developments that I would like to share with the audience, who some of you might not aware of the context of education in Pakistan, but I think one of the things within the Sustainable Development Goals has been highlighted a lot is Pakistan is home to the second highest number of out-of-school children, around 23 million children, which in some countries would be probably quite a lot, even more than the total number of children. So this invites this thought is not simply about number. And I think what Paulo Freire invite us is to go beyond the question of number and ask us who these children are and why these children are out of school and how can they be in the schools. Are they by and if it's a deliberate effort by the oppressor, or is it something that the oppressed has tried to live with? And so I would leave this to a further discussion as we go along. But along with this, there's also an alarming thing that is going on, which is about those who are in the schools are also receiving a kind of education which is not helping them achieve the freedom, the opportunities that they should be achieving. And so while their numbers of achievements is low, their so to speak, freedom are also compromised, where they are probably treated more with the banking concept of education, pouring empty vessels with the subject and core competencies rather than more liberatory and freedom-oriented education. We also see a lot of youth and adult literacy issues. The literacy rate is roughly around 60%. That means 40% of the adult population is still not educated, not literate in that sense. I would like to separate education with the literacy, but they are generally not literate. And what kind of society, what kind of polity, what kind of economics would emerge out of that kind of low literacy rates? Pakistan is also experiencing for past decade the devolution of education to the provinces. And often it is assumed that devolution would result in the improvement education, more responsiveness of the government towards the children. But in fact, it has created more controversy than an outcome. And so there is a tussle going on between the provincial and the federal government about the curriculum objectives, about the educational outcomes. Recently, we have an attempt by the federal government about single national curriculum, which is also highlighting this central provincial dialectic that goes on. But subtle context, the subtle thing which is within these debates between provinces and the federal are the debates about the kind of citizens that we want to have for the future, the kind of curriculum, official curriculum that we want to designate, and debates around those things. But curiously, the central discussion about teachers is not as powerfully coming, because and that's something that we want to highlight. My recent work on teaching license and teaching students is around those ideas. Where I would like to highlight further is this multi-class education system, and here are some statistics about the social fragmentation that we see at least in Pakistani societies, and it would be useful for the people. The statistics, the numbers are from 2012 ASER survey, which is an household survey, but it collects basic statistics, and it did collect some wealth index related information. And in terms of education, they highlighted that the poorest quintile tend to 90%, 91% of them tend to go to government schools, and the richest quintile tend to go to private schools. And I think it is also reflected badly in the learning, that poorest learns much less than this little better off. And if you see them along with this, it's a trend of public-private schools in Pakistan, and we see that from 1990s till 2017-18, while there were only 19% schools in 1999, they are around 38% in 2017-18. So almost doubled, and that requires this kind of situation demands us to raise those larger questions about the equity, about the provision of education in various contexts. The last thing that I would, the second last thing that I would like to highlight is the language issue and the opportunity. Pakistan is a post-colonial country, and we were colonized by the Britishers. We got our independence in 1947, but the remnants of the colonial legacy in the form of English language persist. The reason I'm speaking in English language is also because it's a language of opportunity. It creates doors for us to get better education, get better employment, get better opportunities. And so this colonial legacy continues to divide the society, but also this is replicated alarmingly through our education system, because there is public education, private education, and various other low-fee private schools phenomena which are going on. And the language issue and the multi-class education system are also quite intertwined within this deprived situation. Last but not the least, I would also like to highlight the globalization and this redefinition of oppressor and oppressed. In the 1970s, when Paulo Freire was writing Pedagogy of Oppressed, he was mainly thinking of some national context. But if we see, for example, countries like Pakistan, the decisions in the country are not solely dependent on the choice of the voters or the choice of the government. They are quite dependent also about various global agencies, agents in terms of the technical expertise, technical experts, or the donor agencies or the financial institutions, and they bring in lots of conditions attached to them, either explicitly or implicitly. And Professor Geeta's work on education policy borrowing is quite central to this idea. And so I'm just trying to highlight that pedagogy of oppressed, if it has to be explained now, it has to be also explained within this globalization context. With that, I would jump to my last slide, which is an invitation to a thinking. And I couldn't have an answer to that. I just have a question for all of us to think together, which is critical education possible or even desirable in Pakistani context? I use the word desirable in a very deliberate sense because, and it connects to my earlier idea about whether being neutral, whether being taking sides is as simple as it is for certain countries than for other countries. And I think what we ought to discuss in celebrating Paulo Freire and his ideas is this structural challenges versus teacher agencies, the ideas about problem posing versus banking model of education. And I think this is it's a call for all of us, the educators in Pakistan, but also in other developing countries. And we also have to think in terms of not simply what students learn in terms of the content, but also the kind of citizens that they ought to become in the future. As Professor Trent described, that the climate question is very central nowadays, and Pakistan is already facing that. So I think we have to be critical, and I did my part because just before this session, I was at a ministerial education where I think I did ask the Minister of Education to remind them that though we have a lot of private schools, education is still a state's responsibility, and we are ready to engage and continuously engage. With those random thoughts, I thank you for this opportunity, and I hope we can have further exchanges in Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ali. Thank you for the great presentation, also for leaving us with this question, which I'm sure a lot of participants will be addressing as well. In the meantime, we received some other question focused on the out-of-school children issue. So if I may read that one to you, it's from Noman Siddiqui from Pakistan, who says, in many of the developing countries, out-of-school children is still a major issue. How does Freire and thoughts can help to tackle this issue? And we also had another participant that built on that, Asadullah Khan, to say, to comment that the issue of out-of-school children is to some extent linked with oppressor and oppressed relations, as most of the teachers still take children as slaves and behave like a master. So if you can share a few reflections on this in the context of Pakistan, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
And no, I think it's an important question, and I don't have an exact answer. What I have are some thoughts, and I pose this question with a Freirean lens about looking at the out-of-school children phenomena from the oppressor and the oppressed lens. It also invites us to redefine literacy itself, because in the rural context, the literacy not necessarily be treated as something, the knowledge of letters or the words or how frequently you can read, though these are essential. But literacy in a broader sense need to be understood within a rural context in terms of the farming, for example, where Freire himself tried to work. I think I tend to also agree that the question of out-of-school children in Pakistan is dependent on the structures that have been created since long. In fact, the British education system has been just replicated, promoted, extended, highlighted, and that's one of the reasons that the structures were never broken, were never challenged, were never critiqued. They continue to replicate the oppression. The colonial oppressors were replaced by the what we call brown color oppressors of the post-colonial period, and we never had a chance. What has gone wrong in Pakistani system is that the middle class has exited from the government schools since 1990s, and that is raising the question of voice. Professor Bari has and Irfan has said that the tragedy with the government and public school system is not that it is not producing well. It is because the middle class has moved out of it, and the voice that could challenge the system has gone silent. And so I think these are some of the thoughts that I could offer at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm happy to engage later.
Great. Thank you very much. So I suggest that we now travel to Palestine and Vietnam with Alexandre Meyer-Frey, which will guide us in this presentation on a reflexive journey with Paulo Freire in Palestine and Vietnam. Alexandre.
Thank you, Marina. Can you hear me well, I hope?
Yes, we can hear you well. Yes.
Pleasure. Thank you very much. Yes, let me embark you in a reflective journey for the next 10 minutes or so. But before that, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me. It is great to become more familiar, first of all, with the KIX activities. But also talking about Paulo Freire's work is a real privilege and pleasure for me. And I would like also to thank the co-panelists for their very inspiring presentations. I'm happy to discuss with them after my presentation as well. Perhaps let me just clarify right away that I'm not related to Paulo Freire, despite having Freire as well as my family name, but I like to think that somehow I belong to his intellectual family, but it's just a homonym, right? Just to make it clear. That being said, I must also confess right away that in the various projects I've been involved over the last 20 or 25 years, whether purely, let's say, research projects for publications or more applied mandates, I've never actually really used Paulo Freire's work directly in my research design. So I'm not a Paulo Freire scholar as such. But however, though, I'm certain that his work has profoundly shaped my praxis, let's say in an implicit way. And I'm happy to take the opportunity today to see to what extent precisely, in a reflexive way, his work has influenced my way of understanding educational issues, of researching them, of understanding them, but also it's a bit more challenging perhaps that it's how to transform them into concrete actions. For this purpose, I will focus on Vietnam, where I've spent nearly 20 years working on various educational issues, and Palestine, where I've been working for the last 4 years or so. Of course, in Paulo Freire's work, there are many elements that raise fundamental and philosophical questions, and that can be read, let's say, at different levels of theoretical understanding and empirical applicability. In my 10 minutes, today 10 minutes, the main point perhaps I'd like to focus on and address that really resonates with my practice as a social scientist and as a sociologist is Freire's analysis of education and social change, arguing that education cannot be neutral, that it can either be domesticating, alienating, or liberating, or to quote Paulo Freire himself, to speak a true word is to transform the world. I would like to discuss the relationship between education and social change in light of my experience in Vietnam, to underline the importance of context and history first. Then, with the case of Palestine, for which I would like to address the issue of social change in a situation of protracted crisis. If I start with Vietnam, a rapid transformation has taken place in Vietnam since the mid-80s, 1986 to be precise, through a set of reform policies called Doi Moi, or renovation policies. And when the Doi Moi was launched, a new set of values shifting from a centrally planned economy towards a market economy with the emergence of a middle class profoundly reshaped the objectives of education in the society. The amazing rapid changes that are taking place in Vietnam raises for me the following question: on the social change compass, where do we set the cursor for the social change to be accepted by the people? And what is the role of education in all that? So let me briefly to discuss this point in the light of Vietnam's recent history, perhaps. In Vietnam, a period of more than 40 years of war and deprivation, horrors, tragedies, isolation, have given way to a period of economic and social takeoff with massive poverty reduction from nearly 60% of people in the 90s below the poverty line to less than 7%, 7-8% today, that have redefined the priorities of the population as what they can expect from education. From a social institution guiding the people's will for freedom and independence from the French colonial rule first, and then the American occupation later, education served first from 1945 to 1975 a purpose of liberation. Then after 20 years of isolation embargo, with the launch of the Doi Moi policies in 1986, education served the purpose of Vietnam's reintegration in the international community. And I observed in Vietnam that social change is perpetually in motion by definition, and that values are constantly adapting to the context. Social change came from the masses that were before 1975 deprived to an extent sometimes difficult to imagine. But also in Vietnam, during both the French and the American wars from roughly 1940 to 1970s, a liberating education that affirmed the capacity of people to decide their own destinies was set as a national goal. And liberation education is a sentence that could have been said by both Paulo Freire and Ho Chi Minh himself, who actually used the expression in some of his speeches. So it makes a kind of interesting connection between Paulo Freire and Ho Chi Minh. But of course, with a vision predetermined by the context, the specific context of Vietnam, by certain social groups that took part in the liberation process, such as the nationalist leaders, communist guerrillas, the party, the clans, or what liberation should be. It was not necessarily a vision of liberation produced indigenously, as Paulo Freire said it would have necessary to have. Despite the changes brought by the Doi Moi, new form of inequalities have also emerged, and education actually recently became more let's say, more entrenched in an elitist trend. And the debate of how to keep social change moving on this cursor of social values is a heated debate in Vietnam, where the traditional egalitarian society suffers from assaults of hyper-consumerism and hyper-competitiveness in education as well as in other sectors. Just perhaps two illustrations for this. First of all, tutoring, of course, which is something very popular in many Asian countries, but also in Vietnam. Tutoring schools, but also private tutoring, that take quite often place after the classes or during the weekends. And also perhaps a second illustration is the close to 100,000 Vietnamese out of a population around 90 million that before the COVID were studying abroad, mostly in US and Australia, in top-ranked universities. Education really became an essential social marker for middle classes. This also raises the question, for me at least, what to do with the two pillars, meritocracy and competitiveness, of highly globalized and standardized educational systems, with Paulo Freire's approach of a liberating education needed to support social change. What I keep from this brief Vietnamese example is that the relation between social change and education can be understood as a consequence of the dynamic interaction between social groups, as well as structural, historical, and contextual factors. If I move now to the case of Palestine, figuring out how education and social change are interrelated was a bit more of a challenge for me when I prepared this 10 minutes talk. But actually, perhaps let me situate you a little bit the place where I do work in Palestine with the, by the way, multidisciplinary team of education experts, social workers, and health workers. I work in Tulkarem, which is nearby Nablus, where various forms of education institutions exist, public, private schools, but also the UNRWA schools that are also there. And social change is first aiming at coping with various forms of complex violence. And for instance, in Tulkarem, nearly 80% of households have reported being victims of various forms of violence, whether interpersonal, domestic, crimes of honor, occupation-related violence, etc. The question here for me is how can we sustain social change in the context of protracted crisis, where violence mitigation is essential, and how can we connect different social institutions, including schools, of course, to contribute to it? Here, the solution we actually try to implement in this context was to connect these different social institutions together, because most of them are relatively weak and suffering from many shortcomings, lack of resources, lack of capacities, lack of trust in communities, etc. Our approach was then to consider community dialogue for violence mitigation and to understand what community development meant for our research community through a participatory approach. We got in this project inspired by the meaning of action of Paulo Freire that lies in the conscious development of people's capacities and positioning, considering that there is no transformation or overcoming of the situation of oppression except by moving from a relationship of domination and control and dependence to one of dialogue. This has been mentioned also by some of my colleagues before. It also resonates with the work of someone I'd like to introduce here, which is Jean-Claude Gillet, which is a French sociologist, who discussed the function of community development in order to define the praxis, which reveals actually its strategic importance, particularly in situations of conflict and asymmetrical relations, by promoting the participation of individuals and groups, which is in line with Paulo Freire thoughts. Studies have shown, for instance, that children and youth are often excluded from decision-making processes, leading to an age bias in the relation between education and participation, hindering the development of resilience, which is very important in the context that is in a protracted crisis. To better understand how children can improve their resilience, participatory methodologies are essential in education and social work projects with children and youth living in difficult contexts. Using this kind of participatory approach in Palestine has contributed for us to better understand the linkages between education, social work, participation, resilience, to analyze precisely youth and adults' roles in social actions and interventions. Here, I think the notion of dialogue, participation of communities, including educational actors, are incremental to build precisely resilience towards multiple forms and complex forms of violence to sustain social change. But Paulo Freire has not just influenced the way I see my own research project, but it also really, I think he has profoundly influenced the way I see social reality I observe. And he has, even over time, influenced the way I think of research. I have gradually moved towards more participatory forms of data collection, using, for instance, in Palestine, art-based methods, especially in my work in Palestine, because it's a protracted crisis situation with a lot of violence. And the idea is precisely to establish a more equal relationship between researchees, with less domination and control, and more participation to the construction and objective study. And I think this is for me, a very important learning I got from when I was precisely looking at my own praxis as a researcher, and also trying to see how Paulo Freire has influenced this praxis. With these two brief examples, and apologies for that, of how I see the influence of Paulo Freire's social change concept in my work, I perhaps would like to keep two main messages that I would like to share with you. The first one is that social change can only be contextualized, related to a historical process, that values cannot be imported, and this questions the fundamental core values on modern educational systems for me, namely meritocracy and competitiveness. The second one, which is the one in relation to community dialogue, including education institutions, is for me essential to foster social change, notably in conflict-affected settings. But it raises also the question of how we, I mean, at least the academics that are here together with us today, conduct our own work in our own fields. I would be, of course, very happy to hear a bit more from our audience, how this resonates with their understanding and their own work on how education relates to social change, which is, of course, a very fundamental issue in development policies, and of course, deserves a lot of discussions and debates, and I hope that we can be able to engage together in our next discussion session. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this great presentation, Alexandre. I suggest we start with a question that we just received responding to your presentation, which is a short one from Johnny George that says, is the statement that social protection, education, and poverty are completely unrelated in Vietnam valid?
No, it's not unrelated in Vietnam, in the sense that Vietnam has always had, traditionally, had always this vision of being a very egalitarian society, where the different aspects I just mentioned here, employment, education, social protection, even pensions for war invalids, for instance, are closely related. But that was, there was even the promotion of something called the role model citizen, which was something that existed before 1986. But this has been really, really changing very quickly since 1986, once Vietnam really embraced market economy, that Vietnam really jumped into the global markets and then drastically changed the set of values on this compass, from being an egalitarian society to a society that became gradually but surely more and more unequal. And that was also driven by the education itself, that suddenly from a day to another became being very accessible to everybody. And even, for instance, something that always surprised me very much when I read some of the things Ho Chi Minh wrote, he said in 1954, in one of the discussions he had, I think, with the journalist of the New York Times, he said that for us, when we liberated a province from the French rule, the most important thing, the first thing we're always doing is to rebuild schools, to make sure that everybody had the access to education, which is, of course, not the case under the French colonial rule. So this has profoundly changed with the access of Vietnam to the international community, obviously because values changed quite a lot with the influence of neoliberalism, etc., in the Vietnamese society.
Great. Thank you very much, Alexandre, for clarifying the connection of these factors in Vietnam. So I suggest that now we briefly address a question that came to Professor Sharaf, and then I'll give the floor to Mr. Serhiy Londar from Ukraine, who has raised his hand. But first, Professor Sharaf, we received a question that was related to one of the points in your presentation, which says it is precisely about the 70% theory, 30% practice ratio that you mentioned for pre-service training in the Arab region. So the Alejandra Barlet is asking if you can please elaborate on the reasons why Freire's ideas continue to appear as part of the teacher training curriculum, but do not translate in teaching practice that are specific to the Arab region. And then she asks, could there be a relationship with the few opportunities for teaching practice during their training that you mentioned in the same slide?
Right, thank you for the question. And it's very interesting because each time, you know, the panel sits or a group of academics sit to, you know, revisit and reform the program. I mean, they keep thinking in the traditional way. And this is why I said that we should start with the faculty members, because they keep, you know, recycling the same kind of, the way they were prepared. So they value theory very much. They believe that students should read a lot, write a lot, think and reflect a lot, but not really practice. And then practice is an ipso facto, it would happen anyway. So, and this is why in the future post recommendations, perspectives is that we should start with the faculty members, those who would teach teachers and prepare teachers for academic programs. And this is why it's a self-reiterating system of a traditional way of teaching practices.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, Professor Sharaf. So I suggest that we now hear from Serhiy Londar from Ukraine, who would like to make a question or comment orally. Serhiy, can you hear us?
Я вас слышу. Вы меня
Yes,
слышите?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Здравствуйте, дорогие коллеги.
Hello, dear colleagues. I apologize. Our connection here might not be very good because we have had to move to a different place. We're not working at home anymore. I represent the Institute of Education Analytics, which works for Ukraine and is part of the analytic bodies of the state. And I want to add some comments. Today, our webinar has to do with the work of Paulo Freire in developing the humanitarian development of society. And he proposes a philosophy and method of education. What I want to say is that Tristan Makovan, Said Ali, Alexander Freire, which spoke today, basically they were talking about one thing. The most important thing for Freire is the idea that teaching, pedagogy, is a powerful instrument to form a free person, to make him a subject, an actor, an educated person, which has the ability to critically analyze nature, society, science, and so forth, can transform society, can contribute to sustainable development, and act as a subject, as an actor. For us today, the most important thing in creativity, in the work of Paulo Freire, is that pedagogy makes a person free. Today, Ukraine is fighting for its freedom. And I hope that Ukraine, over the past 30 years, has contributed to the formation of a society of free people. We did not provoke this war. Are the largest country in the world in terms of territory, not sure about intellect, but the largest country in the world with the richest president. And this is something that Elon Musk has said. He said, officially, I'm the richest person, but I'm a lot poorer than that president. And it seemed that if this president has enough money, he thought that he can tell other nations what to do. Over the past 30 days of war, many cities have been totally destroyed. Kharkov, Chernihiv, Nikolaev, and many other cities have been partially or completely destroyed. This is a barbarian humanitarian catastrophe. Children are being killed. 200 children were killed. Have you seen the eyes of a mother who's holding her dead children killed by a Russian bomb? Many of our schools have been completely or partially destroyed, but our Ministry of Education has created conditions to study online. We have internet. Thanks to Elon Musk, we have Starlink satellite internet, and even in mountain regions of the Carpathians, children can go to school. Over the past 30 years, we've destroyed 16,000 Russian occupants. We are on our land, protecting our land. Our flag shows a field of grain under the blue sky. Our main value is freedom, and the legacy of Paulo Freire is something that we will never give up. I thank you for your attention, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Serhi Londar, for this powerful and I'm sure all of our presenters would like to react to that. But I invite if one or two would like to share a few thoughts on Serhi's reflections on what the situation that is going on in Ukraine right now and the powerful work of Freire.
Perhaps I could just say very quick, yeah. Thank you. It's a great pleasure. It's also very moving to have colleagues from Ukraine here with us, and for those people who are not in a position of war, it's unbelievable to think of you engaging with this conversation, given what you're going through. So thank you very much for being with us and for sharing that. And obviously, our very best wishes go to you in this time, and education carries on in the midst of everything. And just a very quick reflection on your comment around freedom as a central idea of what Freire is doing, and I think that's also absolutely right. But we also, the concept of freedom is also a battleground, I think, because it's about how we understand what it means to be free. Because I think someone might say that the sugarcane cutters who Freire first worked with in Pernambuco were free in a manner of speaking, in the sense that they lived in a liberal democracy with well, it was just before the dictatorship, in fact, but at the time, they had lots of theoretical freedoms of movement and so forth, but were completely dependent on resources and literacy and a whole range of other things which they didn't have. So it's also about, I think the Freirean process of transformation is also a struggle for changing the notion of freedom from a kind of a negative one to a positive one, about working collectively to create the conditions in society for all people to have a substantive freedom and not just a formal one, where they can actually realize their life, the life that they want to lead, and create the conditions for all people to do that. Yeah, thank you very much for your reflections.
Спасибо, профессор Маковен, спасибо.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So would any other speakers would like to add something, or we could also move to our closing remarks? Oh, Alexander.
Yes, thank you. It's really an immense pleasure to have colleagues from Ukraine with us today. I'm so happy to actually, I didn't really know that, but I'm so happy to see you here with us today. And having myself worked in a country, Vietnam, that has suffered from more than 40 years of atrocious wars, horrors of all kinds, and working now in Palestine, that it lives in a situation of protracted crisis, conflict-related post-conflict, etc. I just wanted to add one thing about what education does in this kind of context, is that education is also hope. I think it's something I came across a lot when I was discussing with people in Palestine, or when I was talking with people in Vietnam, being very, let's say, the most vulnerable populations across the country. It's that the hope that education can transform and change this relation of domination and control that certain social classes have on other ones, and that this contributes to transform profoundly the society. And this is something I really saw it in very different contexts, such as Vietnam and Palestine, And I think it's something that we should never forget, that education also brings this dimension, especially when we are in situations that are very difficult, so when there's a lot of violence, etc. That's just the only thing I wanted to say, because I believe it's important. But it's great to have you with us today.
Thank you for adding these, Alexander. Before we close, may I suggest that we hear the comment from Natalia Prom, also based in Ukraine.
Коллеги, я извиняюсь, должен покинуть вашу...
Yes, I am sorry, colleagues. I have to leave this webinar. Thank you very much. And I was very happy to see you. I wish you happiness, health, and peace. Thank you.
Dear colleagues, I want to add also some words. So first of all, I want to thank you from all Ukrainian scientists for today's webinar, and that you are not indifferent to the terrible war in Ukraine caused by the Russia aggression. I'm sure that if Paulo Freire were alive today, he would not be silent about what is happening in Ukraine now. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank all international organizations and foreign partners for their support and assistance to Ukraine, which you generously provide, including scientific opportunities for our scientists. But to tell the truth, we ask you to be more active. As you know, on February 21st, Russia launched a full-scale war against Ukraine. Russia's brutal aggression is aimed primarily at destroying the Ukrainian people as a free and democratic nation, dictating pseudo-principles of the Russian world. In these tragic circumstances, all structural elements of our society, among which are the leading place has the educational system, were forced to adapt to the conditions of martial law and then to deal promptly with a number of pedagogical and psychological aspects. So given the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by the aggressor's country from 21st February to 11th March, vacations began in all educational institutions in Ukraine. Since March 14th, the educational process was resumed in all institutions in a distance format, but only in those regions of Ukraine where the security situation allowed it. Under these conditions, the Office of the President of Ukraine, relevant government agencies, the team of the Ministry of Education and Science of Ukraine, in cooperation with NGOs and international partners, launched a number of useful resources for all participants of the training process, which are primarily aimed at providing psychological support, overcoming the traumatic and emotional problems caused by the war and creating conditions for learning, self-development, and receiving help and verified information. It was mentioning some of them, for example, chatbot named Child is Not Alone, which is focused on helping minors in difficult wartime situations. Project All Ukrainian Online Timetable for school students, a platform All Ukrainian School Online containing video lessons, abstracts, test tasks, as well as teachers' office helping to stay in touch with students. Next, educational project Learning Without Borders, and many other useful educational projects. Such initiatives help children to engage in cognitive activities, develop key skills, and get a little bit away from the nowadays war. It should be emphasized that in this process, the psychological aspect was also taken into account, because the content for children under the stress due to the war should be not only interesting and informative, but also safe. And now let me provide some factual data in more detail. Thus, according to the data, during the first month of the war, more than half of the Ukrainian children, namely more than 4 million, were forced to leave their homes and move to safer places, mainly in Western Ukraine or abroad. In particular, nearly 2 million children had been resettled as refugees refugees in neighboring countries and 2.5 million had been internally displaced within Ukraine. Unfortunately, today the number of children killed within the Russian aggression of Ukraine is hundreds of victims, as well as other participants of the educational process. Also, I would like to emphasize that in these circumstances, the Ministry of Education and Science of Ukraine created a website and a special map that collects information on the number of damaged and destroyed educational institutions in Ukraine, as well as losses caused to our educational institutions due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. With a link of this map, I will share in this meeting chat. So, according to actual data, 773 education institutions in Ukraine have suffered bombing and shelling, and 75 of them have been destroyed completely. The aggressor says it's only military objects of our country that are struck. Given this, the Ministry of Education and Science of Ukraine has collected numerous facts and arguments to refute this statement. The Russian troops destroy schools and universities, kindergartens, and orphanages. Today, Ukrainian scholars also place a rare of army and defendants and are doing everything possible to ensure the truth and democratic values, as Paulo Freire noted, come first and foremost. That's why we also ask you not to remain silent about what is happening in Ukraine now, because each of you can make a valuable contribution to restoring peace. If you want to know more information or you want to cooperate with us, I will leave my contacts, my email in this chatbot. So thank you for attention.
Thank you, Natalia, and thank you. And please share the links that you said so in the chat. There are some moments in life that we need to give extra time, and there is no overtime for the solidarity that we have to express to the Ukrainian people and everyone that is affected by this conference. So we thank you for the testimony, and thank you also for the speakers understanding and everyone understanding of the situation. So I'll give a couple of points, just 2 minutes more to close the webinar today. And first, a thank you note to our speakers. I think there is no better way to commemorate Freire's centenary than confirming how Freire's work can be useful in today's context, not only for better education systems, but also to continue education as freedom, as Freire often said. So Rasha Sharaf, Alexander Freire, Sajid Ali, and Professor Tijan McCohen, thank you very much. Our webinar today marks the end of our year 2 of the KIX EAP Hub activities. This is possible. All our activities are made possible through the support of the International Development Research Center in Canada that leads the implementation of the KIX program, and the Global Partnership for Education, which makes the initiative possible in its greater mission to mobilizing and transforming education systems in GPE partner countries. In this, we will continue to promote knowledge and innovation exchange in the EAP region. So please contact your national coordinator, your national teams, to suggest further thematic priorities and further focus of our activities. We also want to learn how we can do better. So you'll see in the chat links to our post-event survey. And we invite you to be linked to our alerts, to our mailing. So you will have the link in the chat also to subscribe to our newsletter, to our frequent alerts about our activities and about everything that relates to education within the region. So our journey does not stop here. It is just starting. Thank you all and see you all soon.